What a world we're living in. And I know for those of all of you who are on the front lines, a lot of this was predictable. A lot of this isn't new, and that is the world we're wrestling in. And so if we're going to really think about transformation and rebuilding the world we think our children and the planet deserve, then we have to be in community with each other. So any excuse to get into a room and learn about what you all are doing and be of service to all of you is a gift. For me, it's a gift for Bridgespan as a nonprofit, so thank you for this opportunity, Liz. So on the topic of big bets, the goal of this session, as Liz mentioned, was to really think about what are the lessons of big bets, what has worked, what hasn't, and given all the different spaces and perspectives we all occupy as funders, as doers, as people that are working in community, in collaborative funds or large organizations, what can we all learn about what should stay with big bets and more should happen, and where might we have to really ask ourselves some hard questions about it and maybe do some things differently? And so as we started wrestling with this being the objective, we were talking about it, and we said, actually, if we look back to when some of the conversation around big bets started, which was over a decade ago, till now, there have already been multiple chapters of big bets, and there has been this reflection and this iteration, sometimes within platforms, sometimes as a sector. And so before we jump into that, and I call in some wonderful friends and colleagues to share their stories, I wanted to give just a little bit of an overview of what Bridgespan as an organization that has had the privilege to be in conversation with philanthropists and philanthropy and work with a lot of nonprofits, both community-based and large nonprofits, as well as with collaboratives. What have we heard about some of the wrestling that has already happened and brought us to this place? And some things have shifted and more needs to shift. So that's kind of what I wanted to just set the stage before we dive in. So 12 years ago, Bridgespan, I remember, we were working with a lot of institutional philanthropy at that point. We had just started talking to a lot of the high net worth individuals that were thinking about how to do their giving. And they had really bold aspirations. People wanted to create large change. And we started looking at where their giving was going. And we were like, there's a mismatch here. People have bold aspirations about the change that they want. And when we looked at the data, 80% of their big bets, and at that time we defined it as over 10 million, unrestricted, long-term, multi-year giving, 80% of it was going to large academic institutions, usually because, ones they had personal connections to hospitals, to cultural institutions, all, valid areas to invest in, but only 20% of the big bets were actually going to social change leaders on the front line. And that data was really helpful to start having conversations with individuals about what is happening here. How is it that you have this aspiration, but you think you're going to get the work done with change? And now if we come back to 12 years later, we have seen, much more needs to be done, so I will put that on the table, and that is the work of so many of us to figure out how do we get more of that to happen. But there have been significant shifts, right? I think there have been over billions of dollars, 20, 30 billion in the last 10 years that have gone towards big bets. Skoll shared their story. We've seen that a lot of organizations have been able to step up and really articulate how are they going to change, create the change that they want. And so we are in a different place right now. And so the story of 5 lessons from that 12 years ago to now that I thought I'll throw out there and kind of share our own vulnerability that Bridgespan tried and stepped back and say maybe we got some things wrong in our advice as well, and how we changed our own practice, given we get to be in some rooms and as the responsibility comes with it. So embedded in this is our own learning journey as well. So when we first started and we're starting to talk to funders about, why aren't more big bets happening, what surfaced was that there are actually 2 sides of the story that they're sitting with. One was their own wrestling with the risk aversion that comes to entering new fields and creating big change, especially if they're not planning to hire thousands or hundreds of people. A lot of individuals wanted to hire 10 people, 15 people, and they were really scared of getting it wrong. They were really scared of not knowing enough before giving big bets, and that was slowing them down, and they were really trying only small things. And when we asked them to what organizations they were looking at, a donor shared this, which came up again, ironically, in a conversation yesterday on a panel where a donor said, my life's too short to fund small dreams. And so a donor started saying, I want to fund big, but I don't see the big ideas. And embedded in that was a reflection for us about, where is the marketplace? Where are people actually learning about ideas? Where are organizations being given the support to dream big and the permission to dream big? And so coming out of that, a number of, MacArthur's 100 and Change came up around there. You had Audacious, you had Co-Impact, Skoll mentioned their shift. So we started seeing organizations giving people permission and resources and an invitation to think big. And that was one of the big unlock in really recognizing we want something, but we're not really creating the enabling environment for it. The other thing that we learned was that inspiration sparks interest, but feasibility drives action. And that was a huge unlock, even within some of the platforms, where donors were, first they needed to be inspired. There were a lot of problems. They wanted to understand what about the problem really was personally hitting them, because otherwise they weren't going to stay with it for a long time if they weren't personally connected to the problem. However, if there was only inspiration, they were not giving, right? And so one of the, I'm sure a lot of you we've spoken to, we've been advising people, and a lot of the platforms started advising organizations that we need to share the problem and inspire donors, but we need to convince them. We need to convince them that if you are angry or worried or motivated about a problem, tell me it is solvable. And tell me why this solution is going to solve it, and tell me why your organization is the right organization to either solve it or to bring the right coalition to solve it. And so this idea of the bridge in the conversation of what was driving action in donors was one where we started hearing more and really getting more organizations equipped to be able to do that. I think an important moment for BridgeSpan was, and we were like, great, a lot of big bets are flowing, good things are happening, it feels good. And then we looked into the data and we said, actually, when you look at who's getting the big bets, there's an uncomfortable truth there, that the early wave of big bets was almost, I don't remember the exact data, but it was a significant majority. Over 3/4 of the big bets were being given to, in the US, white leaders that had the resources and networks to do this, right? To be connected, to be able to put the resources to bear, to develop those actionable plans, and leaders of color, local organizations in second-tier cities when we looked at it. In India, when we looked at where the money was going, it wasn't equitable. And it wasn't really going to leaders that had a lived experience of the work that they were doing. And so this, I think a number of donors started to look at this, from institutional donors as well as individuals. And this led to really rethinking like a little bit of what the sourcing and what was the bias, the explicit and the implicit bias embedded in some of the sourcing and the diligence work. And that was another wave of where the big bets movement started to have an introspective moment of things that actually haven't worked well. That's also a place where local collaborative funds started to be elevated and saying, actually, if you want to give to communities, there are so many brilliant women's funds and local funds that actually we need to acknowledge the value of those funds and use them as a vehicle to be able to distribute resources. Then there was a question of, we've given big bets. Oh my God, have we actually destabilized organizations? Only a donor could ask this question. And I think what was important, on a side, my favorite thing to tell donors when they say this is, why didn't we ask all the private sector companies that we gave billions to whether we're destabilizing? That we will give them the billions and let them become big, but we don't give nonprofits that are trying to solve problems that have been created for centuries and lifetimes, that whether they'll be destabilized. Well, as you all know, no, organizations did not get destabilized. They got strengthened. However, it was strengthened, but there were questions that people who got big bets had to wrestle with, right? Because you've been not allowed to dream for the size of the problem, and the big bets might not come back, right? A number of big bets are one-time big bets. Some organizations get multiple big bets. So organizations started to think about, how do we really use these big bets to be able to create the change, but do it in a way that the change sustains, knowing that there isn't a guarantee that the big bet is going to come back or we'll get another big bet. And this really opened up some really interesting models that organizations started thinking about. Like, should we set up an endowment instead of using the big bet to create the change? Should we think about regranting models that's building the capacity of community-based organizations so we're not scaling our organizations at the size of the problem? How do we embed this into government systems? So we have a new funding stream that is government co-financing. And so this uncertainty around the next big bets and we'll hear from some of our colleagues here who actually had to wrestle with this and think about, in service of the impact, how do you not leave people behind after the 5-7 year cycle? And that was the next kind of wrestling with big bets. And then finally, this question of the winner takes all in big bets, right? We talk about it in philanthropy, and now there was a question about, are big bets aggregating power? And are they aggregating power in organizations and in theories of change? Right? Because when we resource a big bet, that theory of change scales in an ecosystem that is complex. And that's been a place where I know the sector has been wrestling with and thinking about how do you think about big bets that are actually taking an ecosystem view. And here we've had a number of donors. On the donor side, we've been seeing diligence trying to think about where is it that actually regranting in an organization to strengthen the ecosystem is an asset, versus earlier on it might have been seen as a risk, that we don't know where this money is going to go, versus now trying to really think about that as an asset because you're lifting up the ecosystem and really wrestling with what's the collective theory of change. The other aspect became about how do you take an ecosystem, and is a big bet just an organization, or is it actually an ecosystem field building approach? And how do you think about funding fields that is still a big bet, but it might not be centered in an organization? And so those are some conversations that, again, came out to build out of an organization, but to come at it from an ecosystem perspective that was born out of feedback from organizations that said, we had just made progress on something, and someone got a big bet, and we're having to work against that headwind. And how do we collaborate to move in that direction of travel? And this one in particular, I really think is going to be even more important going forward because resources are even more scarce now. We all need to work together and think about the whole field as we develop it. So these are some select learnings. I know we're going to hear more from others, but I wanted to share that by way of grist, but also because we want to continue to learn from you about what are the things that have worked that haven't, so we can make sure we are sharing them out in the spaces that we occupy. If we move on, the three questions that have come up already in some of the pre-meetings with all of you that I wanted to throw out there that would be great for you all to keep at the back of your mind as you hear some of our colleagues talk right now, so we can get into discussion on them. So one is, when the problems are compounding, how do we go even bigger? Right? This is a question that I would love for people that have managed to do this well to think about, are there other ways that we need to think about getting more big bets and making sure we are fueling that part of the funnel? The second one is, what are our blind spots? Right, we all sit in our own spaces, and hopefully this is going to be a candid space to say, what are we not seeing? And inadvertently, what missteps might the big bets movement be making? So we really would love feedback on the blind spots. And then finally, tensions, right? I think we all live in a world where there are often seldom perfect solutions. But we have to name the tension. So even if we're going down a path that isn't perfect, we can hold what are some of the trade-offs that we might have to contend with. So what are the tensions that you're seeing is something we want to go into on the tables. So with that, I'm going to have some of our leaders who are in this work and have experience doing this work just share their stories over the past about how they've experienced big bets and what their journey has been. And then we'll dive into some discussions. So Doug, I'm going to start with you. So Doug Galen from Rippleworks. I know many of you know Doug really well. Wake up. So Doug Galen, CEO, co-founder of Rippleworks. Again, similarly has been a part of big bets for the past decade and a lot of the platforms that we spoke about. So Doug, I want you know, we've spoken about in your 10 years, given what you know now, if you had to go back in your early days of big bets and start that movement again, what have you learned? What would you have done differently? What would you do more of, less of?
All right, you know what that's code for? I get to say what's gone wrong. That's what I've been asked to do. So I come from Silicon Valley. I feel like I'm making a confession. That means I'm wired to chase things and move fast, chase new things and move fast. That's exactly the wrong thing for generational problems on the planet. So first of all, we've learned over the last 10 years that that's wrong. It didn't take us quite that long. We joined Audacious in 2019, 2020. So I'm going to share 3 things in a postscript, a PS. The first one is that big bets have grown up, and that's not a compliment. What has happened with big bets, it started as provocative. Change the status quo, be bold, go for new things, go for it, find new people to support. And what's happened is process has overtaken big bets. It takes too long to fund, the diligence process is very hard, and we need to get back to being provocative. And so if I could go back to 2016, I would try to ingrain that into the thinking of how big bets work. So 1, big bets screw up, not entirely a compliment. 2, the bet ends and the problem doesn't. Yeah. I've been in the room where funders celebrate the moment that the investment has been made. That's where the rah-rah happens. That's where we get all excited. And it is worth celebrating. We are thankful for these funders to come in and to place these big bets. But honestly, many move on to the next thing. The real problem is that we all know the problem didn't end. I often talk with my wife, Susie. Getting engaged and getting married and the day of the wedding, that wasn't the hard part. That was the fun part. We've had to work on it every day, 30-some years later. The same is true for big bets. We have to invest in our orgs. Which takes me to point 3. In big bets, we funded the vision. We forgot to fund the organizations behind it. You know I am crazy passionate about capacity building. Money is only half of the equation. The second half of the equation is building operational excellence so that organizations can achieve their impact potential. Capacity support isn't a nice to have. It must be wired in to all of the work that is being done. And we all know the challenges that we face when you've been given the opportunity for a big bet to try to then address the bigger opportunity. You're being asked to take on scale in an entirely different way. So I said there were 3 things in a PS. So this is a little separate from big bets, but hey, I got another couple minutes. My PS is, and I'm looking at myself in the mirror, every bet should be a big bet. My fear is that big bets is becoming this big thing, and it's the only place to place big bets. Every bet, we as funders should be leaning in to do as much as we possibly can every single time. We don't need to wait for a collaborative. We don't need to wait for something else if we are in this work. I think about Jasmine Foundation in New Zealand. They have funded an organization 19 times. That's beautiful. At Rippleworks, we give all the money up front. We give it all. We don't do multi-year, we just give it whatever we're going to give all up front. And the point is that we all, as funders, need to challenge ourselves to place big bets. The last thing I'll say is on the positive side, what I have loved about collaboratives, and you wait for this next gen of money transfer, collaboratives is the best way to make it easy for people to come in and move money. I have seen beautiful moments in the audacious work where people who don't have the time to place big bets rely on what we call the TED span team, the TED and the bridge span team, on their knowledge and expertise, and have placed bigger bets than they ever would have. And I'm excited for the future of this next gen who's going to lean more into collaboratives. But we need to get collaboratives to be leaner and faster and invest in capacity building. Thanks.
Thank you, Doug. I couldn't agree more on the collaborative side. I think we've seen the same. We've seen, you can.
Are you asking me?
No, I'm not. I'm just acknowledging. I'm acknowledging what you're saying. As I mentioned up front, the risk aversion of funders that don't have large teams, I think one of the things that we learned was they were going to spend so much time learning before doing that's what collaboratives has been really helpful for, to just start doing. And then they can learn alongside and then decide if they want to do something individually, but really getting them in with peers and to hear the provocations that people like Doug have in a room from your peer, it just changes the game and how they start off so that they aren't unlearning 10 years later, but they're learning from the very beginning of their philanthropic journey. So thank you, Doug, for the awesome role you've played in those collaboratives. I also wanted to connect that to our next conversation, Rebecca Firth. Rebecca, where are you? There you are. Friend and just such an awesome entrepreneur. Rebecca leads the Humanitarian OpenStreet team and was an audacious big bet recipient. And really, Rebecca, what you've done, what you were able to dream of as a result of the big bet and the invitation to do that, and what you did after the big bet, a little bit of responding to Doug about the building your organization's capacity and how you thought about what it means to create change in a way that the organization does not need to even grow as much, but the scale needs to grow as long as you have a strong organization. Would love to hear some of your stories and what worked and what challenges came across your journey.
Thank you so much. Okay, so I'm going to speak a bit about how we leveraged our big bet to build a sustainable future for our organization. So Humanitarian OpenStreetMap team, HOT, we are an open source movement of community mappers who are plugging gaps in the map, gaps in data in low and middle income countries around the world. And this was a really cool idea and had some exciting progress at the small scale. But in 2020, the Audacious funders came together to support us to map an area home to 1 billion people who were missing from the world map, and to support development and humanitarian actors all over the place to use that data to better target their programs, work more efficiently and more quickly. As you can tell, that was kind of a tricky thing to do, and we had a handful of staff working globally. So the first thing we were able to do with our big bet that was truly kind of transformative was to build a team that was as close to the problem as possible, even though that was impossible. So no one can be close to 1 billion people. But we built a team of 80 people in 34 countries that speak 36 languages. 91% of our team are bi, tri, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 lingual. And we were able to use that to get the kind of penetration, depth, reach that we needed in communities to make that plan legitimate. The output of that was a huge amount of data, and if you work in a lower middle income country, I can promise you that even if you don't know that you've used it, you have. It sits behind the entire development and humanitarian system, but it's a behind the scenes thing that's hard to sometimes get attention for. We're trying to center the communities we're working with, the problems we're solving, not ourselves, and that can cause kind of a tough problem. So when we came to what do we do next, how do we leverage this moment to build a future that's possible. I'm not sure if you remember, Nidhi, but 2 years ago, you and I had coffee here,
Yes.
And you asked me, what's next? Like, is it 2 billion? And I left that coffee and I thought, oh God, what are we gonna do here? Because the true potential reach of this idea is every low and middle income country, hidden data spots in every single country. That's 6.5 billion people in every sector across the development and humanitarian space. And it got me thinking, like, what we need is not hot to keep mapping, it's the local systems to exist that can continue to map themselves so that we can get away from where we are now, where you need World Bank money, you need large foundation money, you need philanthropy to come in with these big one-shot efforts to map a place and then walk away. You need the local communities that we're working with on those projects to be skilled, supported, ready, and available to continue to do that work. So now we're working on a new model. It's a replication model where we have open sourced our methodology. We accredit communities in that methodology. We bridge them to either kind of partners that we have, but also support them to find their own partners in a marketplace in which they can actually provide map and data services at what we think will be 15% of the current cost. So with that, we'll be able to capture a whole amount of global business that I hope will want to work with us and make that saving. We'll be able to grow the business that we have with our partners and also be able to tap into local business that we know exists. We know it exists because people reach out to us all the time asking us to work with them. And the line items in that local council budget for 2,000, 5,000, 10,000 for data is something we'll be able to tap into. But the critical thing I think about leveraging your big bet for the long term is I wrote the first concept for that in 2022. And it's a 2-pager. And it's really ugly, and I looked at it the other day and I was like, that's where this all started. And we're really making that real in 2026. And I think a lot of the kind of development sector, when you're working on these 12-month grants, 18, 24 if you're lucky grants, is really hard to kind of think in that long range and kind of having the belief in kind of your idea, your organization, because for us, the process to go from that first model to the second model on that big of a scale with that many people, we have 750,000 mappers in our community, required continuous, constant, regular stakeholder engagement behind that idea and that shift. And that was one of the kind of biggest things that a big bet enabled us to do. So thank you so much for the time, and looking forward to hearing from the next solutions.
Thank you, Rebecca. We're going to continue on the theme of how do you strengthen an ecosystem as an organization and really take that broad lens. And I would love to welcome Solange Bandiaky-Badji, the president and coordinator of Rights and Resources Initiative. Solange, that's your work, right? Like strengthening ecosystems and making sure that there is resilience in the community, in the ecosystems. So I'd love to hear from you how your organization does that. We hear a lot of talk. Everyone's talking about strengthening ecosystems, and it's theoretical, but you do that hard work. So tell us about how you do it and how Big Bets have helped you do that, bigger and better.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. I have 4 minutes, so it's going to be 4 points. So the first point is there is no regrets with Big Bets. Can you imagine getting a phone call from Mackenzie Scott Hill Giving saying, is that Solange? Yes. Actually, we will give RRI 90 million. Unrestricted, totally unrestricted, no time bound. That's really great. And I will never regret taking that phone call. But coming to a more serious point around the no regrets, I think the fact that it will allow you to have greater impact, but also to think about scaling and sustaining, which is different from project-based support, where it's just like, one small money, you have 1 year, 6 months to get it done, then how do you call about transformative change? So I think in that sense, it's very important to have big bets, and we need more big bets. But the second point is, there is a question, a big question. Are big bets enough for the scale of change we actually need? And for those of us working on land rights, indigenous people's rights, if you ask me if big bets are transformative, I will say yes. If you ask me if they are sufficient, I will say not yet. Just taking the Rights and Resources Initiative, which is a global coalition of over 200 plus organizations, and working for over 2 decades in 60 countries, then trying to get folks together, different institutions, it's not an easy thing. But most of the time, donors prefer to fund, like, organization than networks. So we need to think about how to fund more the ecosystem, how to fund more networks and more coalition. And what I've learned really being the coordinator of the coalition is that the communities, they know how to do it. And they are preserving the third of the world planet. But one thing is sure, they're only receiving less than 1% of the climate finance. That's an issue. And to me here, the issue is not about impact, it's about access to funding. And this is a solvable problem. Then the third point that I would like to share is the true power of Big Bet is not just how much change one organization can spark on its own. It's how much social impact an entire ecosystem can init together and then sustain. And again, I'm coming back to the power of collective action. A coalition of 200 organizations is a force multiplier. So you invest in that, you invest in shared strategy, shared advocacy, and really building everything together. And as we know, no single organization can do what a truly unified movement can do. And the last point is the next frontier for Big Bet is clear. As we know, development aid is dying and pretty much non-existent. Then we need to think about how do we support communities develop their own livelihoods, develop their local economy, so that way they don't remain eternal beggars. And actually communities, they don't want to be asking for money. And they have the assets. So I believe that right now there's a trend we're seeing in the sector where indigenous organizations, local communities are thinking of livelihood activities, are thinking of developing their own economy. So that way they can use livelihood as a conservation strategy because they know if they preserve their forests, if they preserve their resources, they can get money out of it. So I think that's what we need to think about is how do we really need to support that whole movement of collective livelihood, collective economy, bioeconomy, and how we can call it. So these communities are not waiting to be safe, but they're already innovating. So I think Big Bet should be investing into those innovations and making sure that we have prosperous communities and in like thriving ecosystems. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you. I'm going to call up now James Nardella, the president of Last Mile Health. I think many people know Last Mile Health was, I would say, amongst the early cohorts of some of the big bets that were given out. And James, we heard the bet ends, but the problem continues. We've heard about what it means to think about sustainability. And Last Mile Health has had the responsibility and the privilege of getting multiple big bets, right? You've had a few cycles of big bets, and I know we've spoken about how each one of them has been an opportunity to reimagine, reflect on what worked well and what you need to do differently and get more resilient and sustainable. So I'd love to hear about that journey from the first big bet to where you are now.
Thank you so much, Nidhi. So yes, Last Mile Health, we exist to address a persistent problem, which is that families that live in rural and remote communities face much higher risks of unnecessary sickness and death, and that we want to address that by bringing a health worker within reach of everyone everywhere. We do that by helping governments improve their national community health worker programs so that families, particularly women of reproductive age and children under 5, get the necessary health care that they need. So prior to our first big bet in 2018, Last Mile Health was serving 50,000 people through 300 community health workers in one county of Liberia. 10 years later, we will be serving 50 million people through more than 30,000 community health workers across 4 countries. So big bets have really enabled that kind of 100x growth. But the analogy that I want to leave you with today is an analogy to help us understand that through line. That last mile health, like many of us, prior to our first big bet, we were operating like a bucket brigade, right? We saw the problem. It was a difficult problem to solve. We knew we needed to address it as social entrepreneurs. We got busy doing direct service against that problem, right? Bucket after bucket, delivering services on the ground, right? Raising money, bucket after bucket. It was really heroic work, but it was exhausting. And every time you're reaching for that next bucket, you're wondering, will it come? Will we have the resources? Do we have the capabilities to deliver on this problem? And if anyone drops the bucket, it's really drastic. What big bets enabled was for us to zoom out from the bucket brigade and think about building the aqueduct, right? We wanted to go from running programs at the county level to addressing national level policies in Liberia. We wanted to move from being a single country operator to a multi-country operator. We wanted programmatically to have the theory that would drive that action, to move from being an individual contributor as an organization to working in coalitions. So setting up the aqueduct, that's the piping for that systems level change, was enabled by big bets because it allowed us to think more imaginatively about addressing the real problem. So through our first big bets, we set up, through collaboration, we set up coalitions like the Community Health Impact Coalition. We moved from being a single country operator to having programs in 4 countries. We set up a regional influence initiative called Africa Frontline First, which is aimed to influence the design and size of funding for community health across the continent. These things were enabled by having that space and time. And organizationally, we needed to build the aqueduct as well. That means the human resource systems, the financial systems, the compliance systems to operate as a multi-country organization. So now, what reinvestment has enabled is to move from having that aqueduct, because once you build it with your first round of big bets, you often run out of the resources you need to actually make use of the aqueduct. What reinvestment has done is allowed us to actually tap the aquifer, right? We had the people in place, flagship projects in each of our country markets, impact that we could show, evidence for our work, talent, and what we needed was resource. And so the influx of new capital through reinvestment in Audacious, through money from Mackenzie Scott, we are utilizing that to really achieve flow through our programs and have the impact that we desire. And at the same time, it's giving us the breathing room to imagine what does the community health field need for the future, and even to think about not only how do we make use of the flow for ourselves organizationally, but how do we change the upstream flow for the whole of community health systems across the continent of Africa. So to me, the big challenge to the big bet field is why bet once? Because you've set up the aqueduct through that first bet, why not help organizations achieve flow? Thank you.
Thank you, James. I'm going to call up Gayatri, Nair, Lobo as our next speaker. And it's as you all might know, James, you were not the president when the first big bet was received. And we're seeing this in this sector. We're getting big bets, and it is healthy for organizations to have leadership transitions and founder transitions. And Gayatri, I don't know whether people have reached out to you this week. I'm sure they have. I've had multiple people reach out who are in a leadership transition moment to really wrestle with what does it mean to step into a leadership role after the founder has stepped down and post a big bet life cycle. So I would love to hear from you, and I know many other people are wrestling with this. What has worked to set you up for success, and what have some of the challenges been of stepping in at this particular moment?
Thanks, Nidhi. So actually exactly a year ago, I stepped into the CEO position at Educate Girls at a very interesting time. We had just finished our audacious big bet. We had met all our goals. We enrolled 1.5 million girls into school. We had outstanding RCT results for our learning program. But we had a brand new strategy. So while we had brought in 1.5 million girls, our next big strategy and big goal was to get 10 million learners into school in the next 10 years. Very exciting. But we had no money, right? While I took a big bet in accepting this offer, for a lot of donors, they didn't know who I was. So for them to think about at a time of a leadership transition to take this actual bet on me was probably something very hard for them to do. A lot of our existing funders, thankfully, trusted that if the founder and the board had decided that I can do this, that they believed that I could. And thank you to some of them who are in this room. But what did we do that makes it okay for me to still stand here and say we're still on track on our strategy is a few things that we did with that big bet money. So while we expanded our program operations into new states, we also invested in our fundraising team. So we built our fundraising muscle so that we could actually go out to many more smaller donors for whom this is not as scary of a risk to take. We also brought back some of the donors who were part of the Audacious grant, but rather than as a collaborative, they gave us money individually. And the third thing I'd say we did is that we really started focusing on raising money from within India. Everyone talks about India becoming richer. Unfortunately, the philanthropic growth hasn't been as fast-paced as the economic growth. But there have been some good bright sparks, and we said, let's cash in on these bright sparks and try and bring in some of that money into Educate Girls. So we were very successful in bringing a very large Indian donor who previously only gave to hospitals and universities to actually make a 12 million grant to Educate Girls over the next 5 years. So our largest donor today is an Indian donor, and I'm very happy to say that. Having said that, we still have a long way to go to get to our 10 million. So if anyone's looking at ideas for us on how we can actually grow, happy to be listening, especially at my table. Thank you, Nidhi.
Thank you, Gayatri. And I think the work that you're doing with the Indian donor, that is ecosystem building, right? Because I think Indian, especially domestic philanthropy, going from an operating philanthropy to a grant-making philanthropy, it is usually really slow up front to take a few bets that seem safe, and that's, in our experience, that's when people start doing more down the road. So thank you for taking one for the team with the Indian philanthropists. I'm going to round us out on this round with Lucien, who has been a partner and collaborator in his many roles that he's had, and most recently at the Audacious Project. Lucien, I know you're thinking within the Audacious Project team about you all have had so much success in the last 10 years. It's been over 5 billion you all have unlocked for this sector in really big bets, and we're not counting the indirect funding that has been unlocked. And as you look out into the next 10 years, if you're here back onto this stage in 2036, what do you want to be able to say that has happened in the big bets field that isn't happening now?
Sounds good. I get the fun question of envisioning the future. I'm from the Audacious Project, so when we work with our finalists at Audacious, we're constantly talking about the spectrum between audacity and achievability. And I'm going to say something audacious here, and then we can talk in smaller groups about how that might be achievable. But I think in 10 years from now, I would love us to just completely redefine the concept of big bets, and that philanthropy is actually giving at the size of the problem, and that's the normal way of giving. And so that how we're defining big bets right now is kind of obsolete. So that's my vision. I'll have just 4 kind of points for consideration as we move into discussion after this. One is, so far we've been talking about big bets really from the financial standpoint, about the amount of money that's tied to it. But what if we talk about big bets also in terms of mindset shifts and thinking about how do we shift the paradigm and have big, bold ideas that inspired the donors as well as giving the money to do the work itself. So kind of pairing mindset shifts and strategic clarity alongside the big levels of funding. Two, Doug alluded to this earlier, why do donors fund an organization for a few years and then walk away right as the work is starting to really accelerate? And you heard from all the previous people speaking just how much impact and momentum they've had on their work. And then they're kind of left to figure out what to do after that point in time. And so I think, maybe an uncomfortable thing to say is a lot of collaboratives and philanthropic initiatives, which have been expanding, are really good at launching things, but maybe not so great at finding ways to sustain them. And so I'm hoping that we can kind of find channels for more durable financing to create durable impact. And that's not to say that every organization should be funded in perpetuity, but finding ways to support the organizations that are really having an impressive amount of impact and staying on that journey with them for the longer term. The third point is around how can we make big bets both easier and more joyful. And Doug mentioned this a little bit earlier. I'll say from the Audacious standpoint, and I think this is probably true for many other collaboratives, the process of getting a big bet is quite intense. And so not to say that rigor is not important in this work at all, but can we take some friction out of the system? Can we make it a little bit easier and more joyful for the organizations that are going through it? And so we're not maybe leaving out people who are closest to the problem who might not have the capacity or resources to participate in a process like that. So making it easier on that front. And then on the donor side, I think finding ways to just actually make it more joyful. And I just sit here and listening to all the people before me talk about the work that they've been able to do and the millions of lives that they've been able to impact. And if we can't really find joy in being able to support organizations like that, I think we've kind of lost the plot of the story. And then last point is around how can we kind of build muscle for the whole ecosystem as we think moving forward. And Nidhi kind of mentioned a little bit about how much money Audacious has been able to move. And so far, I think we've been very fortunate with the donors that we've worked with. We've had about $4.6 billion has been committed from our donor community to support all the organizations. But those organizations have also been able to leverage another $4.3 billion. So that's almost a 1-to-1 ratio there. But imagine a future if you could get 2-to-1 or 3-to-1 ratio there, what could happen and what could these organizations do with that level of capital? And so, there's a lot happening in terms of intergenerational wealth transfers coming up, and the now gen in philanthropy who can kind of step up as leaders in this space. And so I'm hoping we can work with them to find more ways to deploy the capital. So to answer the question, I hope 10 years from now we're not standing here in this room or on the stage having the same type of conversation, that we've really redefined what big bets mean, and we can talk about how effectively it's been working, what we've learned.
Thank you, Lucien. Thank you. And I also think there's a lot of collaboratives can learn from what Audacious has done to make it joyful, I think, for the donors, which is what has unlocked going from a first year of funding, which was I think it was 100 million or thereabouts, to now really enormous amount of funding, is the joy that people get from being in community. And so really huge credit to what the Audacious Project has been able to unlock there. We're going to change the plan a little bit because things has gone longer. We wanted to make sure we could get everyone in the room who was there. So here's what we're going to do now. We have about 30 minutes left. I do want to make sure everyone, I'm sure you're sitting with a question. You're like, that was interesting, but I have a follow-on question. We didn't have time for that. So let's take 5 minutes in on your tables to just go around and share what question did this discussion spark for you? What is it that you're just not buying? You're like, I heard that, I don't think it's happening. What is the tension that you're hearing in what's come up? But just use your table discussions for everyone to just share out what's in your space. And then I'd love to bring it back to the full group, and we'll walk around with the mic. And we would love to hear your observations, your questions for anyone who spoke at that point. If you have a follow-on conversation, we would love to hear. So you've got a moderator on your table. Take 5 minutes for that. So obviously there's a lot to talk about. I sat in on one table, and there was an interesting conversation about tensions around observations, around who is getting left out of big bets. So I'd love to open this. For a full group conversation for the next 15 minutes that we have, and maybe just ask for someone who wants to share either tension that's surfaced for them or for their group, and really offer it up to kick off a conversations where we can all react to it. And this could be a tension aimed at someone in particular who spoke, or to the group in general. I also want to request, because we're short on time in particular, introduce your name and your organization, and let's dive into the tension. And there will be time after this to share the work that you're doing with others, but right now let's make sure we get more people to be able to share what they're learning.
Hello everyone, my name is Archana Soreng and I'm here as a Skoll fellow, also for Youth Climate Justice Fund and with Solange. Very briefly, we would like to share about what our group discussed. One of the things is when we talk about big bets, young people is often not discussed. So how do we also see intersectionalities of theme with related to young people, because we need focus big bets on young people. There was conversation around how do we also make this conversation about taxing the rich conversation when we are also talking about it, with issues around compliances and those who are in the margins, how will they able to access the big bets has also been there. But there is this dichotomy or irony about how do community and collective get resources beyond individual people or organizations. And it's also like we are also talking about big bets in these rooms, but how do conversation of big bets become more outward and more systemic changes so that people in the communities back home can access it? Thank you.
Thank you. Did anyone want to react to that? We can.
Yeah, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Lois Auta from the Network of Women with Disabilities, Nigeria, West Africa. Yes, I need to remind big bets that they need to be objective and ensuring that every group have a percentage in the funding platforms. Young people, women, and persons with disabilities, especially persons with disabilities who are double or triple jeopardized and excluded from many global agenda. We want to see funders and donors shifting their minds to this very set of people. And another one that my colleague talked about is sustainability. How sustainable is the funding? After 3 years of project, after 5 years of project, what next? Thank you so much.
Hi, everyone. Vanessa Timmer from One Earth Living. And in our group, we had 3 kind of buckets of conversation. The first is about the finding of big bets. So who decides which field is going to be or problem is going to be the focus? Let's get transparent about that. And secondly, these big problems require collectives. And so how do we start looking at the collective of that the system needs for change and fund that? So that's a finding. The second part is about the work. And part of that is about a shifting landscape. And how comfortable are the funders for the adaptation and rapid adaptation that's needed? And secondly, do they keep, in a way, creating work once you get the money that ends up like a lot of funds end up going straight to the communities that are on the ground at the front lines. But to get systems change at scale, it also requires some of that transition happening in the meso level. And it often ends up being on the backs of the original organization that does that in their free time because they've distributed the funds. So if they're trying to change market conditions, they're doing that on their spare time. And the final thing is, what you were saying, Sarah, is like, how do you actually get to understand that the big bet is actually funding a moment of change, and we have to keep that larger end goal in mind. So the third thing we talked about was the back end. Where do we end up? And what we're noticing is sometimes when big bets get funded, governments and businesses step back because they're like, they've got it. It's happened. So one of the ideas was, imagine if you actually have that one of the big bet solutions is a price point that governments can afford so that governments can pick it up from there. But also, how do we get new philanthropy in here? Because otherwise we're getting big bet follow-up funds from the same funders, but there's so much philanthropic potential, also in different regions of the world that are under-tapped, like in Asia and Africa and different places. So new funders getting excited to jump in at the other end if it's a philanthropic thing. So those, like, how do we find it and be transparent about it? How do we allow for innovation and seeing it's a stage of change? And most of all, how do we pick things up on the back end to keep going to that end goal that we're wanting to get to?
Thank you, Vanessa. Before we share, can I just ask Lucien and Doug to just react to some of those questions? I mean, Lucien, perhaps you shared the follow-on funding that Audacious was able to unlock, to where Vanessa was taking us about how do we unlock more funding as opposed to having people step back. Just offer to the group, what have you seen work where people have been able to do it? What is just whether it's tactics or strategies that have worked? And maybe even the question of, how has maybe the sourcing changed over the last few years so people have a sense of how are people iterating and evolving what they're doing? And then Doug, would love to see if you have initial thoughts on kind of the most marginalized people, right? How are we thinking about how resources are getting, whether it's into the community, whether it's intersectionality, youth, in your conversations with funders, are you hearing that question? And where can we, that play different roles, really, what's the right framing, what's the right provocation that's going to get us to fund the most marginalized that you're seeing? But Lucien, just a few thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think what you named is a problem that we're seeing in the sector, right, is that a lot of the big bets are one time, but the problems don't end in 5 years. And so one of the things we tried out Audacious last year. It was a reinvestment round, and Last Mile Health and HOT were part of that, and Skoll and Rippleworks and other donors are also part of that as well, to do another round of funding to see what the appetite would be from our donor community, but also just in recognition of the fact that there's so much impact to be had, and there was so much momentum with those organizations, and we really wanted to be able to support that. And I think just a problem with the sector, I think, is that in the capital markets, if a company is doing really well, then most investors are going to want to go in and support it further. It's de-risked, and you're going to invest more in those organizations. But for some reason, in the social sector, it doesn't operate like that. So we're trying to move the needle there, but it's slow progress. And I think the more people can get with the shifting mindsets on that front, the better. But it's slow going. I'll admit that.
I'm going to pick up. Stand up. I'm going to pick up and not answer Nidhi's question until she may come back and kill me on it. But which is, I want to go to your comment in terms of what to do. I think government should be part of big bets. Imagine if government came in and matched the money or put up 20% of the money, because now you can start to transfer over. The big thing that I've been talking about in all of these funder rooms these last days is what's the capital stack. And so how do we complete the capital stack all the way to the top to government? And if we can co-create, and if we're willing as philanthropists to de-risk things, let's get government in there. You talked about how do we get this to a price point that can make it work. And if we can get it to a price point and fund to a price point that government will say, I'm in, let's have them at the table. So in terms of most marginalized, I think that funders are looking to help the most marginalized. I am highly confident, except for those with disabilities. Those with disabilities are far behind. And I'm so sorry for that. It's not right. We funded our first organization. We should have 10 more. And we were saddened by how hard it is. So, but in general, I think funders are looking to help the most marginalized, and I am very optimistic that more and more will be funded.
I know we had a hand up.
Hey everyone, Paul Rice, Fairtrade USA. We had a lot of great ideas. I'll share 3. Number 1, building on the notion of capacity building. What about capacity building for the organizations that don't get the big bet investment? Just curious, how many people here have kind of been in the running for a big bet investment and then didn't get it? Please raise your hands. We put a lot of work into those proposals, into that whole process, right? And I don't know about you all, but we didn't get any feedback about why we didn't get it at the end. And what a great opportunity to learn about, how to become investable, maybe next time around. Also, what about maybe a little consolation prize for all the work? Like, $100K maybe to pay us for all the time we put into it, right? Okay, so that's one idea. Two, we loved the idea of donor collaboratives. What about the idea of recipient collaboratives, right? That aggregate a lot of small organizations then that could deploy bigger funds to small organizations. And then the third idea was, what was the third idea? I did. That's three. Thank you.
Is there someone in the room that received a big bet, that was part of a coalition, collaborative, and that really was thinking about how do multiple organizations act? I'm curious if there's someone here that played that role. Are you willing to share kind of what it was about the way you framed? What do you think enabled your success? Because there are a lot of organizations that are supporting an ecosystem, and to be able to talk about your impact and connect with donors at that point sometimes can be a challenge. We'd love to hear your experience with it.
Sure, I think but that's
do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure, I am Zahira from South Africa, work for an organization called Ilifala Bantwana in partnership with Smart Start. I think what worked for us is that the partnership with Smart Start and Grow Great and all the parties that were into it was a partnership before, it wasn't driven by funding. Our vision and our collective was there from the beginning. I don't think it would have worked if it was developed for purpose of funding. So I think that's the one thing that worked for us. The other thing that worked for us is that we were very clear on what our complementary roles were. There was no confusion about how we worked. I can speak about Smart Start's work, and as well as that CEO, as well as how Grace from Smart Start can talk about what we do and what our contribution is. And I think also the way we work with government is cohesively, it's together, we show a common face, we have a common messaging. Does not mean we agree on anything. We agree to disagree in a respectful manner. And I think that's the main thing that worked. And we went in with the application as a coalition. It was a co-impact grant that we got 5 years ago. It was the early foundational grant that we got back in the day. And even just one other point that I think worked, the way the funding flowed from co-impact facilitated how we work together as a coalition. The methodology of giving a design grant first, which is an equivalent of a substantial consolation prize, it actually worked. It gave us the time to figure out how to work together, how to figure out the growing pains of doing something as a coalition, and figure out, is this going to work? Do we really want this marriage to bind us for the next 5 years? And so far it's worked. It hasn't been easy, but it's worked. We're still together. And as we can see the benefits from the coalition with Smarts and one of our partners getting as far as getting a Skoll award.
Thank you. This right there. You got.
I don't have that experience, but I wanted to mention two things I came across in the last couple of months. I was at GPF in San Francisco, and one of the things somebody talked about was focusing on the problem rather than the organization. So when you come together as a set of organization and you're trying to solve the same problem, it wouldn't matter who gets the funding, right? Everybody knows that the destination, you've all agreed that the destination is to cure something or to solve something. And each year is different for each of those people in that group, but they all know that you are the one that is going to drive us forward this year. You are the one that's going to drive us forward for the next 5 years, and that it allows for continuity. That is one thing that I wanted to mention so that people can say. The other thing is he talked about just that, like you've gone through all this process, it takes capacity away from the organization, compensation for that, some kind of compensation for that. And I saw that with livelihood. It's nothing big, but it felt good to say we went through this DD, we actually diverted resources as a small organization to this due diligence, and we didn't get anything. But that token of like, okay, for your time, for your effort, we still want to continue to know you just felt better than not getting anything at all.
Thank you. I'm going to just, I think just let the question sit there, and that, just wonderful advice, and the idea of like, how do we be in community with each other within our ecosystems, within the problems that we're trying to solve. And something that a number of the speakers up front shared, and I know with Rebecca, we spoke a lot about this, was that with the big bet, how do we actually use it not just to be in community, but to use re-granting and resourcing of others in the community to be able to do what they do best, right? How as organizations do we not have to do everything, but really leverage the community? So a few things I'm taking away from this conversation is, one is from the funder side of things. We have to continue to think about what is the full potential and how do we continue, and Doug, I come back to where you started us off with, where the big bet doesn't end if the problem continues, right? These problems are lifetimes in the making, and they're not going to end in cute 3-year, 5-year, 7-year cycles, and we need to reimagine. And sometimes that will look working with government, so we aren't necessarily in a linear process of always being dependent on philanthropy or, God forbid, aid, right, given what's happened right now, but are thinking of sustainability. I think on the funder side, the two other provocations that came up, one was, how do we make sure we're taking an ecosystem approach, thinking about communities as a whole, and how do we need to think about our diligence and how we're asking questions, what we're looking for, so it's, you end up doing what you measure, right? How are we measuring, how are we defining the problems in a way that are a little more holistic, given lives are not one-dimensional lives. Lives are very intersectional, and can we all, there are pockets of it happening really well, can we all continue to put that into the way we think about our sourcing, our diligence? And then, of course, it is how do we all use our own collective networks and our privilege to bring in more funders. And I know everyone in the funding community over here is here because they're trying to do that. And how, and like reaching out to partners about where we need more help to do that. The one thing I will share and then bridge over into some things for organizations on the front line. I was approached by someone who asked, how do we get a big bet? And I don't want to pretend that's not a question on a number of people's minds. My very genuine advice to people is that some of this stuff, there's so many brilliant organizations, right? And there is, I wish there was a secret source. I wish there was. We have published a paper that's called Big Bettable, and we had a session at Skoll about it, and I do think it's very useful. And then we realized it's actually simplifying what it takes. It's making it more technical than it is. My very pure recommendation is be in relationship. When we say trust-based philanthropy, and when we have seen trust-based philanthropy, for better or for worse, funders are trusting other funders and other people who have been in the work of the sector or resourcing. So I would always say go to your board, go to your current funders, and ask them to be your champions in different communities. Ask them for feedback on how can they be champions for you in different spaces that they sit in, and champions of the work that you do, of the theories of change that you're trying to promote. Because there are philanthropists that want to enter into it, but they're nervous sometimes to ask the wrong questions, but they can talk to their peers. So I do think that is an asset we all have as nonprofits, to really leverage those people who have already bought into our theory of change. So I would say really leverage that and take that further. I also love the idea of being in relationship. For all of us that have gotten big bets, really to think about who is the community of other people doing the work, and how are we thinking about re-granting and partnerships as a core part of our theory of change, because to move towards a North Star, it is going to be critical that we do that. And so really bringing along an ecosystem and thinking about how we re-grant, how we share the resources. And for those that aren't getting the big bets, again, being in partnership with organizations. We know organizations that have received big bets, and two of the big questions they ask, Audacious and others, is how do we not alienate funders now because people think we've got a big bet, and how do we not alienate others in our sector? because we're conscious that we got this big bet and others didn't. And I would offer from their perspective, I think they want and everyone needs partnership. So I would just say continuing to be in that community for that partnership will make sure that the resources are being coordinated and shared in a way that takes us all further. So with that, I have my timer with 4 big zeros at the bottom. Thank you all for being here again, and I hope you all have a wonderful rest of Skoll.